An unexpected and increasingly contentious trade standoff is unfolding between the United States and Canada, a conflict that has caught many observers off guard. Canada, in a move that signals a significant shift in its trade strategy, is imposing restrictions on U.S. access to Alaska, introducing new tolls, and rerouting key transit routes. This development poses a substantial challenge to American truckers, businesses, and even military logistics, disrupting established supply chains and raising concerns about the stability of North American trade. The core question remains, is this a calculated political maneuver or a serious attempt by Canada to assert greater control over this crucial trade artery? And perhaps more importantly, how will the United States respond to this unprecedented challenge? British Columbia has implemented a series of new measures, including the introduction of tolls, increased permit restrictions, and tightened oversight on U.S. freight moving through its territory. Experts in international trade and economic policy believe that these actions are less about addressing infrastructure maintenance costs, as the province claims, and more about leveraging economic power to gain concessions from the United States. British Columbia cites a 37% increase in highway repair expenses over the past decade as justification for these measures. However, U.S. officials argue that this is a calculated act of retaliation for American tariffs on Canadian goods, particularly aluminum and lumber, which significantly impacted British Columbia's economy, resulting in over $2.1 billion in lost exports last year. This is not the first instance of Canada restricting access to critical trade infrastructure. Past incidents, such as the 2022 proposal for new carbon tolls on U.S. energy shipments, which was quietly dropped after pressure from Washington, highlight the underlying tensions in the trade relationship. Now, with the imposition of fresh tariffs from the U.S., British Columbia appears to be using its control over key transit routes as a strategic bargaining chip. According to trade economist Meredith Lilly, this is a direct response to Washington's economic pressure, a clear warning shot, not only to the U.S. government, but also to American industries that rely heavily on Canada's infrastructure. These restrictions did not emerge in isolation. They follow a series of escalating trade disputes between the two nations, including the U.S. decision to quadruple tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber to 23.1% in early 2024. The U.S. argues that these tariffs are necessary to counteract government subsidies that benefit Canadian lumber producers, creating an unfair competitive advantage. However, Ottawa vehemently rejects this characterization, calling the tariffs an economic attack that violates the terms of the USMCA trade agreement. The impact of these trade disputes is already evident. Canadian lumber exports to the U.S. have plummeted by 17%, while American housing costs have surged as builders face increased material costs. The new transit tolls on U.S. cargo bound for Alaska are widely seen as a direct countermeasure by Canada. Canadian Trade Minister Mary Ang stated in a press conference that these actions are necessary to ensure that Canada's economic interests are not dictated by Washington's policies. However, U.S. officials warn that Canada is effectively weaponizing critical infrastructure, an accusation that Canada firmly denies. The legal battle surrounding these restrictions is complex and multifaceted. Under the USMCA, Canada is prohibited from imposing trade barriers that unreasonably restrict U.S. commerce. However, the agreement allows for exceptions related to infrastructure maintenance, environmental protection, and national security concerns. Canada is strategically exploiting these loopholes by classifying the new tolls and permit fees as necessary for sustainable infrastructure funding, thereby attempting to circumvent direct violations of the agreement. According to Toronto-based trade lawyer Mark Warner, Canada is threading a legal needle, implementing measures that are restrictive but not a clear-cut breach of the USMCA. However, under the regulations of the World Trade Organization, WTO, the U.S. has stronger grounds to challenge these restrictions. Washington is preparing a formal WTO complaint, arguing that Canada's tolls create an unfair burden on American commerce, violating Article 5 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which mandates freedom of transit. A successful challenge could force Canada to reverse course. However, WTO rulings typically take years, meaning that U.S. businesses will bear the costs of these restrictions in the short term. Alaska's economy is already feeling the significant impact of these trade disputes. The state's reliance on Canadian infrastructure is nearly absolute. Over 85% of all goods shipped from the lower 48 states to Alaska must pass through British Columbia, making the province an unavoidable choke point for food, fuel, and industrial supplies. The Alaska Marine Highway System, a critical ferry network, depends heavily on Canadian ports. Delays and increased costs are already costing Alaska's economy an estimated $200 million annually in increased transportation expenses. Energy is another area of vulnerability. Alaska imports 45% of its refined fuel via Canada, meaning that any extended dispute could lead to fuel shortages and price hikes. Governor Mike Dunleavy has warned that prolonged restrictions could devastate supply chains and drive up costs for every Alaskan household. Meanwhile, the U.S. military, which operates strategic bases in Alaska vital for Arctic defense, is closely monitoring how this situation affects logistics. The economic consequences are rippling beyond Alaska, directly impacting American supply chains and businesses. The financial impact is immediate. Increased transit costs could raise the price of Alaskan seafood exports by 18% as companies reroute shipments through alternative and costlier supply chains. In the construction sector, where Alaskan projects source 70% of materials from the U.S. mainland, companies report shipping costs are already up by 22% compared to last year. The trucking industry is one of the hardest hit, with American freight companies moving goods through Canada now facing a projected $450 million in additional fees annually. Major logistics firms like FedEx and UPS have already adjusted their pricing models to reflect higher fuel surcharge charges and customs-related delays. According to Jared Bernstein, a senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, if this situation continues, consumers will feel the impact in the form of higher grocery prices, retail goods, and even Amazon deliveries to Alaska. The broader economic damage extends beyond increased costs. It also undermines market confidence. U.S. trade with Canada amounts to $830 billion annually, and disruptions like this raise serious concerns about the stability of North America's supply chains. Yet, despite the mounting costs, Canada has shown no sign of backing down. While some observers see this as a negotiation tactic, Canadian officials insist that the restrictions are not temporary measures. Internal memos leaked to CBC News indicate that Ottawa views this as a long-term strategic move to pressure Washington into rolling back tariffs. According to Christopher Sands, director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, Canada isn't bluffing. This is a calculated pressure campaign, and they're prepared to sustain it as long as necessary. Political dynamics also play a significant role. With a Canadian federal election approaching in 2025, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau faces growing pressure from domestic industries affected by U.S. tariffs. By taking a hard line, his administration strengthens its position with key economic sectors, particularly in British Columbia and Ontario. Meanwhile, opposition parties are calling for even stronger trade countermeasures against Washington. Former Conservative Trade Minister Ed Fass stated in an interview with the Globe and Mail that Trudeau's government is posturing, but once businesses start losing billions, the political calculus could shift. Despite U.S. backlash, the Canadian government has instructed customs and transportation authorities to proceed with full enforcement of the new trade barriers. And if the U.S. escalates, Canada is prepared to expand these measures. What happens next depends on Washington's response, but one thing is clear: this trade fight is just beginning. Washington has multiple levers to retaliate, and early signals suggest that energy exports are Canada's most vulnerable point. The U.S. imports more than 60% of Canada's total crude oil exports, making energy a prime target for countermeasures. Industry analysts at Goldman Sachs predict that if Washington imposes even a 10% tariff on Canadian crude, it could cost Canada's oil industry $8.5 billion annually, triggering price hikes that would ripple across Canadian consumers. Senator Dan Sullivan has already proposed legislation restricting Canadian firms' access to U.S. energy infrastructure, warning that if Canada weaponizes trade routes, Washington has the power to cut off energy pipelines that keep their economy running. Beyond oil, the U.S. could raise tariffs on Canada's automotive sector, a $66 billion industry heavily reliant on American demand. Ontario-based auto manufacturers, which ship 85% of their vehicles to the U.S., could see production costs surge if Washington imposes levies on parts and finished vehicles. In a leaked memo obtained by the Globe and Mail, the Canadian Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association warned Ottawa that U.S. tariffs on vehicles alone could slash industry revenue by 12%. While direct retaliation hasn't been announced, U.S. trade officials are reportedly preparing a multi-pronged response targeting energy, agriculture, and manufacturing exports, suggesting that Canada's new restrictions may come at a steep cost. While British Columbia is at the forefront of this dispute, Ontario and Quebec are quietly considering their own economic countermeasures, largely in response to the U.S. decision to quadruple tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber to 23.1% in 2024. Ontario Premier Doug Ford is lobbying for higher tolls on U.S. trucking routes, specifically targeting commercial transport passing through the Detroit-Windsor corridor, a trade artery handling $300 million in goods daily. Quebec, which exports $7.8 billion in agricultural products annually, is exploring new export tax credits to offset losses from U.S. restrictions, a move that U.S. officials argue could amount to an illegal subsidy under WTO rules. Meanwhile, Alberta is considering restricting U.S. natural gas shipments that pass through Canadian pipelines en route to Asian markets. The province supplies nearly 18% of U.S. gas imports, and cutting off or rerouting those exports could increase U.S. energy costs by as much as 14% this winter, according to the American Gas Association. While Ottawa has avoided endorsing these provincial measures outright, internal reports from the Canadian Ministry of Trade indicate that Trudeau's government is weighing broader nationwide tariffs on U.S. agricultural goods if tensions continue to escalate. With multiple provinces responding to U.S. pressure in different ways, the likelihood of a broader North American trade conflict is rising. Analysts warn that this could become the largest U.S.-Canada trade dispute since the 1980s lumber wars, a conflict that lasted over 2 decades and cost Canadian businesses more than $12 billion in penalties and lost revenue. The key difference this time is the scale of economic interdependence between the two countries. In 2023, U.S.-Canada trade totaled $830 billion, making Canada the U.S.'s second-largest trading partner after China. A prolonged dispute could impact not just tariffs, but long-term investment decisions, supply chain reliability, and North American economic policy alignment. Major U.S. firms with Canadian operations, including Ford, General Motors, and Amazon, have expressed concern over the rising costs of cross-border logistics. In a private letter to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, leaked by the Wall Street Journal, corporate leaders warned that new Canadian restrictions could increase business costs by as much as 15% annually, with ripple effects on everything from e-commerce to manufacturing. Meanwhile, Canada's trade diversification efforts with BRICS nations suggest that Ottawa is preparing for a long-term strategy to reduce reliance on the U.S. If this standoff escalates, businesses may be forced to rethink supply chains, and consumers will be the ones absorbing the financial fallout. Historically, U.S.-Canada trade disputes have been long-lasting, but ultimately resolved through diplomatic negotiations. The 2018 steel and aluminum tariffs cost Canadian manufacturers over $1.6 billion before they were lifted in 2019. But the scars remain, with Canadian businesses increasingly wary of Washington's trade policies. Unlike past disputes, however, this standoff targets a critical trade artery, Alaska's land routes, giving Canada unprecedented leverage. According to Christopher Sands, director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, this isn't just another tariff battle. Canada is testing whether control over trade infrastructure can be a strategic weapon. If the U.S. retaliates by blocking Canadian oil exports or agricultural shipments, the conflict could surpass previous trade wars in both financial damage and long-term economic realignment. Unlike past disputes where tariff battles stayed within specific industries, this one affects supply chains at a national level, raising concerns that both sides may be underestimating the economic fallout. If this dispute continues, it could fundamentally alter North America's trade architecture, forcing both nations to rethink supply chain integration and economic interdependence. The U.S. may push for greater self-reliance in energy and manufacturing, incentivizing companies to reduce dependence on Canadian raw materials and transport routes. Mexico, already benefiting from nearshoring trends, could see a surge in investment as American companies seek alternative suppliers for Canada. This could accelerate Canada's efforts to secure direct trade routes to Europe and Asia, bypassing the U.S. entirely. New port expansions in Halifax and Vancouver are designed to handle larger container volumes, reducing reliance on U.S. transit hubs. If Canada successfully shifts even a fraction of its trade away from the U.S., it could diminish Washington's economic leverage over Ottawa in future disputes. But in the short term, both economies are bracing for higher costs, supply chain disruptions, and a prolonged period of economic uncertainty. The escalating trade dispute between the U.S. and Canada presents a complex and potentially transformative challenge to North American commerce. We've explored the intricate details of this standoff, but the repercussions are still unfolding. What are your thoughts on this unprecedented trade conflict and its potential long-term implications? Share your insights in the comments below. If you found this analysis informative, please like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on these critical issues. Your support helps us bring you in-depth coverage of these evolving events. Thank you for watching.